The horror genre is immaculate. It's a fantastic avenue for experimentation and expression, so the scares are only limited by the developer's imagination. During the console generation, horror games seemed to stagnate, with big horror IPs like Resident Evil and Silent Hill becoming less and less interesting to players. Enter indie games, where literally anyone can make a game on their own. A concept that seemed foreign back in the day is now a huge thriving community of creative people, all working without a big studio's involvement or budget. Out of this movement came independent horror games that reshaped the way players and even veteran game developers thought about the genre. A decade later, we see indie horror games beating out some of the bigger studio-driven games in reception, with some even surpassing what one would think about the term indie. Now, this list isn't strictly for independent or AAA horror games, as you'll see both making this list. But the point I'm trying to make is that in this day and age, the line between a big studio horror game and an indie horror game has blurred enough to the point that we can unify and compare the two. This list isn't at all a best of horror games either, as it encompasses my personal opinions and preferences. If you have a favorite horror game that didn't make this list, feel free to shout it out in the comments below. Now without further ado, here are my top 10 favorite horror games. It's extremely rare for a AAA studio to release a game completely under the radar, while simultaneously having it masked as something completely different. But that's what happened back in 2014 with PT, a playable teaser for the then up-and-coming Silent Hills. Although technically not a full game, PT did more with the Silent Hill franchise than Konami has done with the IP in years. In fact, this simple teaser did such a good job that I even consider it the best and scariest Silent Hill game to date. The game opted for a first-person psychological experience in opposition to the traditional third-person survival horror that the series was known for. Not only did this change in perspective work to create a bigger impact for the reveal of Norman Reedus as the protagonist at the end, but it also served to get the player closer to the action, leading to greater scares. It had a very indie feel to it, yet was incredibly well designed, actively inspiring hundreds of indie horror developers in its wake. Moments of suspense and tenseness were plenty in this short experience, and it never felt like the scares overstayed their welcome, nor did the game ever give the player a break. PT was such a brilliant game that it honestly deserves a higher spot on this list. However, since its release, Konami has cancelled the Silent Hill project and removed the playable teaser from the PlayStation Store, making the game practically impossible to play if you haven't already downloaded it. It's such a shame too, since Silent Hills was going to be a collaborative effort between Metal Gear series director Hideo Kojima, horror film director Guillermo del Toro, and Walking Dead star Norman Reedus. While we may never get another Silent Hill to live up to the hype of this one, at the very least we saw the unity of these three in Death Stranding. When you think about visual novels, you probably imagine dating simulators, branching storylines, or a thinly veiled hentai art book. But every now and then, there will come a VN that completely changes the way you look at stories in general. At least that's how I felt after I played Gen Urobuchi's Saya no Uta. Now, I love visual novels, so naturally, when one comes along that centers on Lovecraftian horror, while being penned by the legendary writer of Puella Magi Madoka Magica, then you can imagine my excitement when I got my hands on this game. Saya no Uta, or The Song of Saya in the West, is as much a twisted love story as it is a terrifying tragedy. The story was written with the intention to unsettle and disturb its readers, bringing up dark themes such as cannibalism and molestation. Each aspect of the visual novel is incredibly well done, from its voice talents to the CG to its soundtrack, which is one of the most haunting and creepiest soundtracks to any visual novel. I mean, just listen to this track titled Sin. Through all the horrors encountered in its narrative, Saya no Uta still managed to have an incredibly empathetic love story that brought me to tears. It's unnerving, it's heartfelt, and it's a fantastic horror game. What is a horror game? Is it a survival against some terrifying monster? Is it a game where your protagonist helplessly screams as the monster tears their body apart? Is it still a horror game when those roles are reversed? I myself would answer yes, as the next game on this list is Carry On. Developed by Phobia Game Studio and published by Devolver Digital, Carrion puts players in the role of an amalgamated beast that tears its way through an underground facility in the vein of a Metroidvania, while ripping apart and eating anything and anyone that gets in its way. The game features beautiful 2D pixel art with sharp contrast, and it's just so awesome to look at, especially if you love a good retro look. The way the creature moves is so fluid and feels so good to control. Eating the helpless humans in the game is so satisfying and never gets old. On top of all of this, you also get Mega Man style upgrades throughout the game, making you an even more unstoppable killing machine. Carrion is a blast to play. It's so much fun the whole way through that the ending will have you craving more. And if you want to see more Carrion, I did a full playthrough of it on my channel, so check it out. Horror games often set their players in similar locales like hospitals, spooky castles, or haunted mansions. But it's really refreshing when a horror game goes beyond typical settings, allowing their players to experience a new realm of horror, and that's exactly what you'll get in Observer. The game was developed by Bloober Team after the success of their previous work, Layers of Fear, but Observer is such a huge contrast in almost every aspect compared to the last game. It has a clearer narrative with a more interactive protagonist, other people to interact with, and perhaps the biggest difference, a Blade Runner-esque cyberpunk setting. Pitting the players in a sci-fi world leads to unique and imaginative environments that all harken back to the centralized dystopian theme. With the addition of impressive and surprising gameplay elements, Observer feels like a totally unique horror game to others on the market. The narrative and setting are ones that any neo-noir fan would love. To top it all off as an incredible horror experience is just icing on the cake. I love it when a game makes you reflect on not only the decisions you're making throughout the journey, but also your decisions in real life. Soma does just that in many ways throughout its narrative. The game tasks the player several times with tough moral decisions that bite their sense of values and causes them to question things they probably haven't before, at least in my experience with the game. The majority of the game takes place in an underwater facility, decaying after years of human absence. You will encounter corrupted AI possessing rusted and grimy robotic machines that are either hostile toward you or limp and passive. The implication that all these beings are the uploaded minds of people long since passed away, now turned insane due to years of isolation in a foreign body, is equal parts horrifying and sorrowful. Soma is one of the only games that really made me think about how grim the future may very well be. And I felt with the progression of technology and endless search of human immortality that this could very well be the fate of humanity. Frictional Games did a fantastic job at creating a terrifying and thought-provoking experience with this one. And speaking of frictional games, Amnesia: The Dark Descent was Frictional Games' second big IP after the Penumbra series, and their first huge success in horror game development. Although Penumbra saw much acclaim, Amnesia became a phenomenon that solidified the developers as survival horror game masters. Because this game has been so synonymous online, especially when it first came out, it can be easy to forget that this is an indie horror game. In fact, it's probably the most prime example of an indie horror game to surpass in critical reception the AAA horror games of its time, popularizing the indie horror genre and inspiring many horror games for years to follow. Although YouTube Let's Plays contribute a lot to the game's success, Amnesia is more than just reaction fodder. What set the game apart from others was its complete lack of combat, leaving the players entirely helpless when facing off against some of the horrid monsters lurking in the castle. The game also features a sanity meter, adding a greater amount of depth to the gameplay. I will always remember Amnesia: The Dark Descent to be the first horror game to really get under my skin and make me scream. Although 12 years have passed, and many games have copied and reinvented its formula, Amnesia should still be revered as a horror classic that changed the way we all think about, look at, and play a horror game. Now, all of these games are considered horror for a reason. They're scary, but no other game on this list is more horrifying in every sense, from atmosphere to aesthetic, than Outlast. This game bleeds terror from the very beginning, before you even start the game. The style and aesthetic of this game all revolve around exploring a dark environment equipped with nothing but a night vision camera, and what you may encounter through your lens is horrifying. I don't know about you, but images of creatures caught by night vision cameras are very unsettling to me. To add to the horror, the whole game takes place within an abandoned psychiatric hospital, with many of its patients being hostile threats whom, much like amnesia, you are entirely defenseless against. Although a lot of these encounters with these patients are scripted, these scenes are immediately iconic as they're sure to freak out any player. The characters within the hospital are also incredibly well fleshed out and memorable, each with their own personalities and character developments instead of just being a bunch of crazy beasts. Outlast is a thrilling roller coaster ride of horror the whole way through. There are very few games that come out nowadays that completely redefine and revitalize a whole genre, become a world sensation, and include an entourage of best girls. I'm talking of course about Doki Doki Literature Club. Now I know I already put a visual novel on this list, and some of you might not even consider the genre being games, but Doki Doki Literature Club goes beyond what you'd expect from a typical visual novel. The game is deceptive right from launch, posing as a generic dating simulator with a cast of girls who you, the player character, have to romance. All goes south, however, when one of the characters, in an anxiety-infused state, commits suicide and the whole game resets as if she never existed. The second playthrough is when the real horror starts, and what sets the game apart from so many other visual novels. Not only are some of the scenes uniquely shocking, some of them you will never encounter without a full reset, making each person's experience distinctive of their own. The narrative is genius on playing with the reader's empathy, as it begins sweet enough for them to get attached to the characters, only for them to become corrupted, mentally unstable, and ultimately erased. The game breaks the fourth wall several times to invite the player into its world in ingenious ways. Some of the characters not only talk directly to the player, but the game actively encourages them to alter the local files to affect the narrative. Doki Doki Literature Club is not only brimming with horror in and of itself, but it's also packed with hidden lore hidden deep throughout its files, creating an ARG to further clue players in on the developing world Team Salvato are crafting. I love this game so much as it left a huge impact on me when I first played it. Seriously, I was speechless after reading the final note from Monica and I couldn't even sleep that night. And if you love Doki Doki Literature Club, I did a full playthrough of it on my channel, so check it out. There's something bittersweet about a game that takes inspiration from real-world tragedies. On one hand, it reminds us about terrible events that took place in world history. On the other hand, it can help to inform players who may not be aware of those events and allow them to empathize with individuals who may have lived through it. Detention is a game that takes place in Taiwan during the 1960s, a period of martial law where the country was controlled by the Republic of China's armed forces. While sensitive topics like this are easily to fumble from overgeneralization and the distortion of historical events, Detention never falls short of its sorrowful story, remaining empathetic and foreboding the whole time. While the narrative is incredible and definitely what drives the player throughout the gameplay itself takes no backseat. It's as intense as it gets for a side-scrolling adventure game, and features incredible creature designs and super unnerving scenes. Detention was so influential that it spawned a novel, live-action film, and Netflix series. Although Red Candle Games received so much acclaim from this game, unfortunately their second game, Devotion, was almost immediately banned in China, and subsequently pulled from Steam due to perceived anti-Chinese symbolism and themes. While the developers have since re-released the game on their website, the controversy is just another reminder that censorship still has much impact in our lives to this day. In many of the games on this list, you may have noticed that I prefer games with a heavy narrative focus. While this is true with most games that I play, my number one favorite horror game is mainly here for its gameplay and scares alone. There are so many horror games that I played over the years, and while many of them have made me jump from time to time, none have made me more legitimately terrified than Lost in Vivo. This game was developed by Kira, the same person who made Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, another one of my favorite horror games that didn't make this list. Lost in Vivo is a throwback PS1 style horror game in the vein of Silent Hill. The game is a constant, non-stop barrage of scares, from the traditional jump scare to the claustrophobic areas with unsettling tension, to the game completely screwing with the player, similar to Eternal Darkness. Throughout the whole game, you feel like you're being chased by something, only to encounter a horrible monstrosity just around the corner. The soundtrack is immaculate in both its creepiness and catchiness, as it also harkens back to early Silent Hill tracks. Lost in Vivo scared me like no other game has in years, and is my current favorite horror game of all time. It just feels like the cultivation of many indie horror titles of the past, and I loved and dreaded every moment of my time playing it. And if you'd like to see more of Lost in Vivo, I did a full playthrough of it on my channel, so check it out. So those were my top 10 favorite horror games. Let me know your thoughts on these games if you played any of them. And don't forget to leave some of your favorite horror games down in the comments below. This is the first time I've done a video like this, and I would like to do more. So let me know what top 10s you'd like to see in the future. Thanks for watching, and have a spooky day!